Welcome back. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Monday through Friday, you hear me on the Salem Radio Network. Saturday mornings, I'm right here on MSNBC. This morning, all eyes on the world are fixed on Syria, where the U.S., France, and the U.K. struck hard last night. To discuss this and what may lie ahead, I've asked retired United States Marine Corps Major General Mel Spiese to join me. General Spiese retired in 2013 after 36 years in the Marine Corps, where he spent his professional career with and around friends and colleagues named John Kelly and James Mattis, who we now know as the White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of Defense. Marine Corps Generals Joe Dunford and Robert Neller, who are respectively Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Commandant of the Marine Corps. All four men and thousands more men and women in the American military are very busy this morning, as are those in the forces of our allies. General Spiese, welcome. Thank you for joining us from Charlotte this morning.
Absolutely. Good morning, Hugh.
First, basic question. Judging from what you saw and have seen and have read, was it a successful exercise last night, the airstrikes?
Sure. It sounds like we were able to thread the tactical needles of getting into just the facilities we were interested in, as described by General Dunford, and it sounds like we were able to have effect on those targets.
Now, your friend, General Dunford, at the press conference last night said there was no coordination with the Russians, but reports this morning are that, in fact, there was some notification. What's your assessment of this?
I don't think notification is the same thing as coordination, Hugh, and it sounds like we went through the normal procedures, just explaining we would be operating in certain airspace so they wouldn't be surprised when aircraft or other things in the air showed up.
So, General, you know the complexity of these things. What order of complexity is getting these three militaries to combine to find and execute this sort of attack on this time space?
Actually, Hugh, I don't think it's all that difficult, given that we've been operating with these allies in somewhat similar types of operations over the last couple of years. We're talking about very competent professional military forces. The procedures to put aircraft in place, to do the deconfliction, to do the timing for weapons on target, it's pretty standard procedure. And I suspect that once those decisions were made, the specific technical plans for this were put together pretty quickly.
Now, General, this is a question about Marines running the military right now. Last night, the Secretary of Defense is a Marine General, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is a Marine General, the Chief of Staff at the White House is a Marine General, of course, the Commandant's always a Marine General. Does that change the way that we lean into these, do you think, and the way that we plan these in any significant way?
Well, you have to manage a bit both my bias as a Marine and also my understanding and knowledge of those you mentioned, Hugh. But there is clearly a bias towards action. It's ingrained in Marines. You hear that in General Mattis's speaking. You hear that from General Dunford. You get that from General Kelly as well. But I also think what you get is clarity on what we're seeking to achieve, that the decisions that are being made are hardly reckless, but very focused on achieving an outcome.
Now, General Spiese, General Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis last night said this is a one-time shot. An hour after the president said we're prepared to sustain this. And last night the French foreign minister said, if they cross this red line again, we will strike again. What is the message, the total message that you got out of all of the inputs you received yesterday?
I don't think there's necessarily an inconsistency in that. General Mattis is speaking about this particular action in retribution for the recent activities of the Syrians. And I think what the president was speaking towards, if the Syrians continue this, as well as the French comments, that we could revisit this again. And I don't think that's necessarily difficult to put together from the three different comments that were made.
All right, now let's talk about Mr. Putin and second-order effects. First of all, do you think Putin blinked? And why did he have allow Assad to do this in the first place? But he was making a lot of noises. Do you think he blinked? And what happens as a consequence, second-order impacts of these attacks last night?
Yeah, I think the comments this morning, trying to understand why Assad would do this at this point in the war, are really confusing. And I suspect he made those decisions unilaterally. I don't know about Putin necessarily blinking. I think he got a message with the ability for us to get these strikes in. And if, in fact, the air defenses didn't have any impact and everything was able to get on target, the message to him was, and maybe what he got a couple of weeks ago with the other ground action in Syria, is if they get involved with us, it's an overmatch in our favor.
What is the message in Pyongyang that was received? The president's going to be meeting with Prime Minister Abe this week, as was mentioned in the panel before you. And obviously, somewhere in Pyongyang, they were watching last night and wondering what that telegraphs for our upcoming summit with the North Koreans. What do you think?
Well, again, Hugh, the message is if we want to go after a target, we're going to be able to the target. And I'm not sure there's anybody in the world that can stop us. You know, there might have to be some other actions. I don't know if we stripped away air defense before we got aircraft or in the airspace where they were launching the weapons. But, you know, we might have to do that a bit to make sure we can penetrate into the target. But we know how to do that. We know where the targets are. We know where the defenses are. And we know how to break those systems down in order to get to where we need to be.
There is no report yet of any cyber offensive against the Syrian or the Russian capability. I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up a little bit later. But we did have some angry words from Syria, so I want to talk about our vulnerabilities, both in the region where American troops are and around the world where Hezbollah and Iran has operated sleeper cells around the world and have struck outside of their borders, Iran particularly. What's the threat level to our troops in northern Syria and to our bases nearby? What's the threat level in the United States, where only a year ago we arrested a couple of people in New York for being Hezbollah sleeper cell agents doing forward planning?
I'm not sure that threat level necessarily changes because Syria's not particularly in control of those. So if Iran were to make a decision to activate some of those, they would be doing it on behalf of Syria. And I'm not so sure they want to escalate a contest with us over our very narrow attacks in Syria. And again, if Assad made this decision on his own, not necessarily in conjunction or coordination with the Iranians and the Russians, they may come to the conclusion that he gets what he deserves in that. So I think there's still more that needs to be learned.
Let's talk a little bit about the day after a major strike like this. We saw sustained campaigns in Kosovo and in Libya. We've seen one-offs before from this president and other places. What's the American military doing this morning, General Spiese, aside from assessing targeting? What happens next?
I think at this particular point, we're watching the response of the Syrians in particular. Again, the message from General Mattis was that we were going after these particular targets for a particular reason. We're only going to do it one time. So I think our orientation now, in addition to the assessments, as you mentioned, are looking to see the behavior of the Syrians. And if we see them maybe ignore us and they start mustering their chemical agents again, then you'll see us tool up to go after them one more time.
You know, the Security Council meeting, which was the one I had watched the most since before the invasion of Iraq, was fascinating yesterday. But the French ambassador to the UN actually said the regime has reached the end of the line. It's gone past that. There was a lot of sort of apocalyptic rhetoric at the UN yesterday. Do you think that's justified given what we saw last night, or was this just a last chance warning in force to Assad?
I think it's more the latter, Hugh. The people who are going to determine the length of the Assad regime aren't in New York. Okay. Frankly, I don't know that they're in Washington either. I think it's in Moscow and in Tehran that'll determine that.
Great. Let's see. By the way, the president has just tweeted. Let's put it up here and see what he has had to say. Thank you, General Mel Spiese. He says, a perfectly executed strike last night. Thank you to France and United Kingdom for their wisdom and the power of their fine military. Could not have had a better result. Mission accomplished. Now, that's an interesting choice of words, given that it is associated with George W. Bush and the early call of victory in Iraq. Don't know that the president knew that when he did.